Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Money Advisor podcast. I'm Steve Sandusky. We've got another great show lined up here today, and I have a couple special guests. So let me just introduce who we have here today. So we have Steve Horwitz, and Steve is the Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise and Director of the Institute for the Study of Political Economy in the Department of Economics in the Miller College of Business at Ball State University. He's also the author of 4 books and is a widely recognized scholar on Austrian economics, monetary theory and history, and American economic history. And Steve, it is a real pleasure to have you here on the show today. So thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Steve. Good to be here.
And also joining us today is Jeremy Keil. Jeremy is a CFP, a CFA, and he's a retirement-focused financial planner with Keil Financial Partners. He's the host of the Retirement Revealed blog and podcast. And Jeremy was the Wisconsin Libertarian Party Executive Director in 2003 and served on the Libertarian National Committee from 2004 to 2008. And Jeremy, you're going to be my co-pilot here today, and I appreciate you being with us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, this is going to be a treat for me because I don't know a whole lot about libertarianism or Austrian economics until I would say the last few months. So I've definitely done a deep dive here. So this will be a good education for me, and I appreciate both of you being here. So let me just kind of briefly set some context, and then we'll jump into some questions here. So I do want to explore what Austrian economics is. I want to discuss libertarianism. I want to talk about Bitcoin and how a greater knowledge of these 3 areas can help us better understand what is happening in our economy today. And so as I see it, I think our economic system is essentially at an inflection point. We've got a lot of things happening, a lot of cross currents. We have dramatic wealth inequality. We have extreme political polarization. We've got massive money printing. We have high debt with near zero interest rates. We've got significant inflation in certain areas. And of course, we've got the pandemic, which worldwide has killed millions of people and also caused major disruptions to supply chains. And with that, we also have the rise of digital assets, or the decline of digital assets, as is happening today as we're recording. And I think the digital assets are really challenging kind of the separation between money and state, so to speak. So anyway, so with all that, Steve, I'd love for you to maybe just share a little bit about, as an Austrian economist and someone with this strong libertarian background, how do you kind of see what's happening, and does the Austrian School of Economics, does it have some tools that can help us put what's happening in our economy today in context and maybe give us some solutions to help us dig out of some of these issues I've just mentioned?
I think it does. I want to start by making just a small note. I've been actually writing a piece about Bitcoin, and we'll certainly talk more about that later. I just want to thank you for calling it a digital asset and not a digital currency. And that's really, I think, an important distinction that is sometimes missed in the talking about Bitcoin. So what can the Austrian school bring to this mess that we're in? It's hard to know where to start. I think the most important thing is that the Austrian school's emphasis has always been on the importance of entrepreneurship, of markets, of competition, as being the processes by which we improve human beings' lives, by which we progress, by which we engage in peaceful interaction with each other, and that we produce prosperity. And I think that we're entering a time right now where those ideas are under severe threat, as you note, for all the reasons that you're talking about, from the macroeconomic side, in terms of the enormous amount of spending we're engaged in, and the enormous amount of debt that it has involved, to the kinds of restrictions that came with the pandemic that thankfully seem to be easing up significantly. Whether they'll all ever go away is an interesting question as well. One of the key insights I think that Austrians and sort of our fellow travelers talk about is Milton Friedman's version of it was that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So I think the Austrian School can help us understand why these top-down approaches, in particular to trying to solve problems, don't tend to work very well, and that we get better results when we leave people free to explore and compete and offer alternatives alternative ways of providing goods and services to people. So that's sort of the pandemic stuff, but it's also I think the macroeconomic stuff. And we see these enormous spending bills, many of which the spending that's going on have often little to do with the thing that they're supposed to be addressing, like the pandemic or other kinds of things, and often become tools for special interests to sort of further their own interests and to acquire privileges from the state that end up harming the public at large, though benefiting those with the privilege. And for Austrians, I think looking at a world in which the marketplace is full of unneeded regulations and interventions and opportunities for especially business people to enrich themselves through government at the expense of the rest of us is certainly troubling. And just one other thing we should talk about that you mentioned too, that threat of inflation, is present. It's real. It's an issue that Austrians have always been concerned with, and I think sometimes too concerned with. The joke, of course, is that Austrians have predicted 10 of the last 0 hyperinflations. So we have to be, many of us in the academic world of Austrian economics are a lot more careful than folks are who are handing out investment advice. No offense to my colleagues here.
That's great.
But we do, inflation can be a real problem, and whether it's on the horizon right now, I think is a more pertinent question than has been the case for the last 20 years.
Well, let's talk about inflation here for a minute, since you brought that up. We're definitely seeing it in certain areas, whether it's lumber prices or asset price inflation. And my understanding of the Austrian school is that it's really more of a hard money school. People might call them gold bugs. But obviously now we've got a lot of people talking about modern monetary theory and using that as a way to describe how our government spending system works. So how do you think about that? Should we be back on a gold standard? Should we have a harder form of money, so to speak? And then also, I know I got a lot of questions here, but modern monetary theory, how do you view that? And I'll just stop there and see what your thoughts are.
So I might take these in the reverse order, right? Sort of modern monetary theory someone has said it's neither modern nor really a good theory, but it is a sort of modern version of a lot of ideas that have been around for a long time and mostly perceived to be fallacious, and certainly fallacious by Austrians. At the end of the day, the key to modern monetary theory is the belief that you can continue to, as we've talked about, that governments can continue to produce currency, produce money to finance things like the Green New Deal and all the rest of these spending programs that we're seeing. And if you are the world's reserve currency, you don't really have to worry about that too much, especially in a world, as the MMT people say, where there is significant unemployment, and that this sort of the spending that will come from all of these additions to the money supply they believe will sort of just bring the idle workers into employment, and in fact will not put upward pressure on prices. And then they say, and even if it does, the way you solve this problem, they argue, is by in effect raising taxes. And then if you raise taxes and basically take the funds you raise from taxes and don't respend them, whether it's just sit on them in sort of the treasury balances at the Fed, that will tamp down inflation. But here's where our friends in the sort of public choice school come into play, which is, wait a second, what evidence, what reason do we possibly have to believe that when governments bring in more revenue, they're not going to turn around and just spend it, right? Every single time we've seen these sort of tax increases with sort of these higher goals in mind, right? The self-interest of politicians is what matters here. So there's a kind of, I don't know if naivete is the right word, but a lack of I think good analysis, good institutional analysis about the way politics works. That's at the heart of MMT. So let's talk about the other stuff. Austrians have long, the one thing that unites Austrians about the sort of hard money type issues is I think that we all agree that ideally we don't want a monopoly central bank. What the alternative is and how realistic those alternatives are and what that means for right now, there's a good deal of debate on. I think the majority of what I would call kind of academic Austrian economists would see that the ideal would be to get rid of the central bank and its monopoly status, allow individual banks to compete by offering currency and deposits and all those kind of things, which would presumably be redeemable in something like gold or some other thing outside the banking system. And the key here is that what all of these things do is to provide a discipline on the money supply. Right. What we ultimately care about is having a set of institutions that do not allow the money supply to grow out of control. Just to look at the Fed's balance sheet recently will be evidence of that. And there are other Austrians who have sort of other ways of thinking about this, but I think the idea of competing currencies based on some kind of standard outside the banking system, and there's all kinds of things there, is I think really the key thing that Austrians talk about. There is another interesting discussion about, okay, well, given that we have a central bank, what do we do? But even there, the idea is to find ways to constrain the Fed and central banks to rule. So in that sense, that concern with inflation is really at the center of things, in sort of proposals that, for me, it's not so much about hard money and gold as it is about competition versus monopoly. And I think that's maybe another way to put it.
Okay. Well, the central bank is a relatively new phenomenon. I think it's just a little over 100 years old here in the United States. So before that, we did have different types of currencies. We had banks that had to compete. And so as you think about, and you're a historian of that, so you certainly understand that well. So as you think about how our economy and our banking system and our monetary system operated back in the 1800s compared to today, I mean, is it even realistic that given technology, given society, that we could operate in a banking system where banks are competing, that there's no central bank? I mean, could that feasibly function today?
Yep, more so. In fact, I think this is there's an argument that says the more complex things get, the more we need top-down control, and I think that's actually backwards. Certainly, Austrians would see it as backwards. That the more complex things get, the less well top-down control works, and the more we need evolutionary competitive processes to generate social or an economic order. And if you go back and look, I mean, the history of 19th century banking is really interesting. In the United States, we had competing banks, but they were significantly regulated, especially after the Civil War, in ways that caused them to not work very well. The regulations that existed at the time, particularly the limits on their ability to operate branches across the country. So you had this kind of mom and pop banks everywhere, and that continued really into the 20th century and was a big part of the Great Depression as well. The instructive comparison are our friends to the north up in Canada, who had a system much more like the one that would be truly free and competitive. And they avoided the problems we had. We had these banking panics in the 19th century and all that. And the Canadians avoided that almost completely. They didn't have a central bank till 1934. And the best explanation for why they adopted one was pretty much, well, everyone else has one. We should have one too. Because it wasn't so much that they were having major problems, even early in the Great Depression. So I think there's a lot of historical evidence to indicate that this kind of system can work. And one of the things that technology brings us is enables us to do those systems more efficiently, more cheaply. Banks don't have to hold as many reserves. We have ways of moving money around. We have debit cards as opposed to just currency and into the 20th century checks. So there's all kinds of ways I think that sort of system works. And as it stands, the majority of the money that people use today in the United States is actually produced competitively. If you write a check, old school, or if you use your debit card or move money, anything, not a credit card, but move things out of your bank account, right? That money is competitively produced. When I use my bank account at Chase, I'm using money that's a liability of Chase. If you use KeyBank, your money's from Key, right? If you use Bank of America, your money's from them. So we already have it. We just don't have it for currency, for paper money, and we don't have it, and therefore we have a central bank that monopolizes that production of currency, and that's the real problem, is that sort of getting them out of that business and being able to create reserves out of nowhere, off of which banks can create more funds. And so that's the thing we really need to work on.
So if we go back to the early 70s, when our last link to the gold standard was severed, and so maybe we just touch a second on maybe the cause of why we severed that last link in the early 70s. And then from your standpoint, was that ultimately, I'm going to guess I know the answer to this, was that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm assuming that that was a bad thing. But let's say we never severed the link. What would things be like today? If you can kind of scope out what would have happened if Nixon would not have made that final sever in the early 70s. What do you think would be the impact today?
That's actually a really interesting counter-historical question or counterfactual question. But go to the first. The reason that was done was we were using inflation to finance the Vietnam War, right? And at the time, the link that existed to gold was that foreign central banks could send dollars back to the Fed and get gold in return. You and I couldn't do it, but the foreign central banks could. And so we had an increase in the number of dollars in the 60s and early 1970, many of which were going overseas. Foreign central banks were coming to call saying, we want our gold. Gold was draining out of Fort Knox and other places. And so the decision was made to, we call it today, close the gold window and not offer that anymore. And that broke the last link, the last economic cost that the Fed paid for inflating, right? Now, the only costs that the Fed pays for inflating are political ones, right? Will the public tolerate inflation is basically the question. The answer is oftentimes yes, or at least not enough to sort of do anything about it. And so we have a largely unconstrained central bank now compared to before. So what would have things been like if we hadn't done that? That's a really interesting question. I suspect the 70s would have looked a lot different. Vietnam might have ended earlier as the sort of continued pressure on the Fed to pay out in gold would have put limits on the Fed's ability to continue to create money to support the war and to sort of generate the inflation we associate with the 1970s. I think we wouldn't, the 70s might have looked a lot better than they did. After that, when we sort of got monetary things under control for a while, I'm not sure it would have been all that different. But now, fast forward to where we are sort of today, or the last, the sort of, let's call it the Obama, Trump, Biden years, maybe Bush too, maybe post 9/11 is a better way to put it, where we have expanded the size of government significantly, and the ability of the Fed to create money to buy government bonds and to support that process is there. And especially with the globalization of the economy, if it had been doing that but still having to pay gold out through the gold window, the guess would be we would not have seen nearly as much of that money creation as we did. Again, it was the last remaining economic cost or economic check on the Fed, and it's not coincidental that removing it has opened the possibility of all these kinds of problematic interventions that we've seen.
So there's an assumption, I think, from pretty much everyone in government that we have to grow. The economy's got to grow 2, 3, 4, 5% per year, and everything is about growth. Mm-hmm. And if I understand kind of the Austrian view, is that maybe that's not an assumption that we should make. And then there's this idea of low time preference versus high time preference. And in the Austrian view, is like perpetual growth, is that an objective, or is it, no, there needs to be some kind of equilibrium in that, nature doesn't grow perpetually. Trees don't grow perpetually. There's a kind of a regrowth. How does the Austrian school view this idea of growth?
That's really great question. And so here's what I would say. I think that growth for growth's sake is a problem, right? Austrians love economic growth. I tend to try to say economic progress rather than growth. And I think for reasons related to this question, which is if growth just means sort of more stuff, right? More activity, more GDP. In that sense, Austrians are skeptical, right? What we really care about is progress. Are people getting better off, or particularly the least well off, getting better off to, are we becoming more productive and so on. So in that sense, Austrians want to see more progress. But I think the other part of your question is really important. Austrians believe that savings is important, right? And that when our low time preference is in some sense a good thing, but it's all wrapped up with an important point, which is all of that saving, which is another way of saying more saving means lower time preferences, is that savings is what's channeled into investment and the creation of capital, and that's what gives us growth over time. So I think a better way to put this is what Austrians are critical of is people who say, well, we need to always be about consumption, that what economic growth is fueling consumption. If people would just consume more, we'd be better off. That's the fallacy Austrians, I think, object to. what Austrians would say, and says, no, it's not about consumption, because if we consume things, what does the word mean, right? They're gone. We've used them, right? The way we grow in the long term is by saving, by accumulating capital that gives us the ability to invest in machines and other kinds of things that make us more productive, makes labor more productive. Workers produce more value. They get paid better, right? Costs of goods fall. That's progress, right? That's good. Call it good growth if you want. Promoting and that's what enables, of course, people to consume. But promoting consumption as the thing we want to do to generate growth has it backward. And so I think that if I were going to sort of rephrase your question, almost, I'd say what Austrians object to is the focus on consumption, not the focus on growth. And so much of government policy is about consumption. And one small thing about that, one of the reasons is that people say, well, consumption is 70% of GDP. True, but it's also the most stable portion of GDP. It doesn't vary, even through business cycles. It doesn't vary all that much. The thing that varies more is investment. It's a smaller portion of GDP, but that's what we care about, right? And the importance there of having that investment spending that generates capital. Well, you can't get that without saving, and that means people have to be willing to be patient about the future, and believe that the future will, that those investments will pay off down the road.
And can the U.S., let's say the U.S. kind of follows an Austrian view of how the economy works. Given that we're in a global society and a global economic system in many respects, is it even possible that the US could have this view? And then you've got someone like China, which has very high savings rates, and their percent of their economy that is devoted to consumption is much lower than here in the US. I mean, can we kind of isolate ourselves and say, we're going to do it this way, and the rest of the world can do what they want, and everything will still kind of work out in the end?
I think it's important that sort of Austrians aren't saying people, in some sense of the word, should save a lot or should save more, or that we should have policies that artificially support that, right? Instead, what Austrians are saying, if you want growth and progress, right, you need to save and you need to create capital and so forth. I mean, it is true that China, and I don't know so much now, but for a while, certainly Japan, right, had much higher saving rate, and that enables them to generate capital. Now, what they've chosen to do with it, and sort of the way the state in particular has allocated it, might not be particularly ideal. But you need those resources to grow. And so, and again, the question, I don't want to frame it as a question of the US competing with China. It's really, we want a world in which US citizens, consumers, households can decide for themselves how much they want to save, how much they want to invest, and that we create an environment in which they're confident about the future, that things will go well, that they will be willing to save, and they'll get a return for it. I mean, in the low interest rate environment right now, savings isn't such a great deal, and that's a problem as well. So we want an environment in which savings is a choice that people will want to make, and that they understand that doing so is good for them, but also generates the capital we need to have progress.
Well, Jeremy, I've been asking a lot of questions here. I would imagine you've got some here for the professor as well.
Yeah, you're talking about savings, you're talking about inflation. I think the generally accepted thought right now is the only way to help people to get savings is to have government programs. And the only way to fight inflation is if they have some central bank saying, oh, inflation's gone. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, it's the second part has some truth to it, right? That if you want to reduce inflation, the central bank's got to stop creating money, right? I mean, you can back it up one step and say, governments need to stop deficit spending and sort of creating the market for bonds that the central bank's then stepping in to buy and create funds. So yeah, at the end of the day, the only thing responsible for that inflation is the central bank, and it's up to them to stop it. As for the savings part, you don't need to force people to save if you're letting markets determine interest rates more to themselves and not flooding markets with funds, right? I mean, you can imagine, right, that people might be willing to save more if rates go up, and So, we don't want to artificially encourage that savings, and those programs aren't going to really do it. But we certainly want to find ways of reforming institutions that make the return to savings greater than it would be, than it is now, and than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, I like how you said force there. So I think that's maybe a little tie into the libertarian part of philosophy or politics, is that somehow there's the belief that humans just don't do anything good on their own, and so somehow the government has to be there to encourage them or make them do what's best for themselves. Which just my mind thinking about it, if humans aren't that good in general, that they can't do this on their own, how do we have magically great humans that are running the government that can get the rest of us to do it? Right?
No, I think that's a really important insight, right? I mean, that's the insight in some way that won James Buchanan the Nobel Prize in 1986, is to recognize that when we analyze political interaction, we have to assume that we're dealing with the same kind of people we have in market interactions. And so we can't assume that people in markets are either or both stupid and selfish, but suddenly when they enter politics, they're brilliant and altruistic, right? It's the same people, engaging in exchange to improve themselves. The question is, and I think this goes to your question, is okay, what are the institutional rules that provide the incentives and knowledge to people in those various arenas? So, in the marketplace, the fact that markets work doesn't rely on the fact that people are smart, right? We can be kind of, silly and short-sighted and all those things. What it relies on is that we have the signals that are generated by prices and profits and losses that inform us when we mess up, and that provide us an incentive to correct our behavior in ways that improve those outcomes. And we, Austrians have reason to believe that the signals and incentives generated by markets are much superior to the ones generated by the institutions of politics. So put the same people in two different realms, there's going to be good results in one because the rules of the game are better, right? And bad results in the other because the rules of the game are worse. It's not about the people, it's about the institutions and rules that they're operating under.
Yeah, I like how you said signals. There's no committee needed for all of a sudden just the marketplace to realize, oh my goodness, lumber prices are up. Perhaps more people want lumber. We should give the people what they want. Right. And it's not even, yes, it's profit seeking, but it's not even like, how do we make the most money? It's people are telling the market they want something. They don't have to vote. They don't have to write their congressman. The prices are signaling to the producers, go give us what we want.
Yep, go get more lumber, bring it here, right? And and bringing both. So I sometimes say prices are an incentive wrapped in knowledge, right? I mean, they bring both, right? They provide that signal, but they also provide the incentive. On the particular case of lumber, though, I do think it's worth pointing out that some of those high lumber prices were just in the middle of putting a little bit of thing on our deck, and the guy who's doing it who built the deck for us, a whole screen porch, said, good thing you didn't, we did it a few years ago. Good thing you're not trying to do this today. It cost you 3 times as much today, right?
Right.
We have to look at things like tariffs and other poor government policies that have made those lumber prices worse. But certainly, right, price goes up. It's a signal flare, as a friend of mine says, and it tells people, bring more lumber in, bring it here, and that's what people need, and you'll be rewarded for it.
Yeah.
I want to talk about deflation here for a minute, because it seems like traditional economics, Keynesian economics, for the most part, says deflation is terrible. And the central bank says we want to grow, we want to target about 2% inflation per year. But I think the Austrian school would suggest that there's maybe nothing necessarily wrong with deflation. And if you think about progress, if you think about technology advancement, that really prices should decline as technology improves over time. So how do you think about the concept of deflation? Is that something we should not worry about? And again, given where we are today with the world we live in today, is that even possible? And if we were to experience deflation, would there be like a huge adjustment in the economy to switch from a 2% or more inflation to actual deflation?
So I think the way to go at this, the way that Austrians would go at it, is distinguish between what we might call good deflation and bad deflation. So the good deflation is what you're describing, right? Which is, we should see, if we conduct our monetary policy correctly, we should see as productivity increases, right, prices of things fall and stuff gets cheaper, and that's good for all of us, right? That wages go farther and so on. In fact, if you look over the sort of course of the last 100 years, let's say, and you look at the amount of time the average worker has to work at the sort of average private sector wage to buy certain goods and services, that time has fallen dramatically, right? Stuff is way cheaper in terms of time than it used to be. We don't see it in the nominal prices because of inflation and other kinds of things. So in that sense, those processes are working and they're at work. And in the US before the Fed in the latter half of the 19th century, prices did fall by 1% or 2% per year because monetary policy was pretty good. And productivity was happening, and so increasing, and so those prices fell. So yeah, I think in a well-behaved economy with good monetary policy, we would see a slow, steady fall in prices. It's not only not harmful, it's good, or at least a byproduct of something good. Bad deflation, though, is an absolute sort of decrease in the money supply, right? Inflation means there's too much money. Deflation, the bad deflation, monetary deflation, means there's too little. And too little money is a problem too, as we saw in 1930 to 1933. To some degree, there's disagreement among Austrians about that period. I think more of us, particularly the academic Austrians, have come to the sort of argument that, yeah, that deflation was really bad, and we can talk about it in Austrian terms. There's still some folks, associated with kind of Murray Rothbard's views who think that deflation was a terrible idea. But as Mises said, you don't solve if you run over someone with a car, you don't make them better by backing up and running over them again, right? So you don't want to, deflation after an inflation doesn't help. You want to stop the inflation, but you don't want to sort of actually deflate. So that is a problem. Deflation is a problem. It's not a real worry in the sort of modern world because central banks have every incentive to make their errors in the other direction. They're helped when they can inflate, right? Deflation hurts the central bank, hurts governments to be precise, right? Because their debt gets worth more and so forth. And if you want to talk about, if there's good deflation, bad deflation, and ugly deflation, that's really what happened in the 30s and 40s. I mean, we not only had 30s anyway, we had deflation, but we also had policies that prevented prices from falling in response to that monetary deflation, which only exacerbated the problems. I mean, that was what was really happening during the Hoover years. And so deflation can be monetary deflation like that can be a real problem, but the productivity generated deflation, not. For your viewers who are sort of more, can remember their econ, another way to put this is we want deflation that comes from increases in aggregate supply. We don't want ones that come from decreases in aggregate demand. That's a simplistic way to see this distinction.
Yeah, and I think also just psychologically, as humans, we've been conditioned that our income, we want it to go up every year. And so if we had a deflationary environment and then our income stays flat and businesses are not going to pay you more money because prices are going down, the prices that they can sell their goods and services at is going down, I think there'd be a psychological adjustment to that as well.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, we understand the difference between nominal wages and real wages because everyone wants cost of living raises. So we kind of get that. But how well we would be patient in the face of no change in our nominal wage, but getting raises because prices are falling is a really interesting question. And it would be a very different way of looking at the world. But as I sort of said when I started, when you look at the time prices of all of these goods and services, one of the ways that most Americans have become wealthier in the last 100 years is precisely through that process. Whatever was happening with their wages, we're so much wealthier because stuff is just so much cheaper and takes up so much less of a share of our income. Just as one statistic, over the last 100 years, food, shelter, and clothing, food, shelter, clothing, as a percent of the average American household's income has fallen from 75% to 35%, right? And so, we have all of this because it's become so cheap, right? And so now, how do we afford our cell phones and our cable TV and everything else? There's the answer. The other stuff, we've gotten so good at the other stuff. It's so much.
Yeah, that's the problem. We never if we have all this efficiency in food, clothing, and shelter, it's not like we're going to work fewer hours. Like 100 years ago, people used to say, oh, in 30, 40 years, we're going to be working 10 hours a week because we're so productive. Well, no, again, I think it's human psychology that we want more and more and more. And so rather than, spending more time in leisure, we're going like, oh, I've got more time now. I can do more work. I can make more money. I can buy more stuff.
Right. And I think it's important because the critique of that from the left, sometimes in particular, and it's more so from the right too these days, is said, oh, well, that's consumerism, right? And wouldn't we all be better off if we worked 20 hours a week instead of 40 and had time to do this and that and the other? And my kind of response to that is, I think you really probably should ask some poor folks whether or not their lives are better off by continuing to work 40 hours a week as those prices fall, meaning they can afford food that they couldn't before, they can have better food, they can afford clothes they couldn't afford before. We Americans live in better houses than we did before, and not to mention things like medical care and all the rest, that despite what we hear, right, the prices of individual medical care is much cheaper. You can go walk into Walmart, get antibiotics or blood pressure medicine for essentially nothing 20, 30 years ago. No, you couldn't do that. So yeah, we're all, the things that we're choosing, the reasons why we want to keep working 40 hours a week as prices fall are not because necessarily we want more toys, though they're nice, but it really does help people lead much better lives in all these sort of non-material ways that I think are important to emphasize.
And I want to dig into libertarianism here a little bit, and then I want to talk about Bitcoin, and maybe Bitcoin could kind of wrap up the Austrian view and libertarianism and just see where there might be some overlap and what the rise of this stateless digital asset, I'm not going to call it a currency, digital asset, what that really means. So Jeremy, let me toss that question over to you. What does being a libertarian mean to you?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a blessing and a curse that libertarianism is both a philosophy and a political movement. So I think in some other way, you need to separate that there are libertarian kind of philosopher, like they've got a mindset. I was thinking through my definition, and it's just that all people have the right to live their life the way they choose and do not have the right to prevent others from living their life. That's a libertarian philosophy, and some people might disagree with that. Meanwhile, libertarian politics is creating policies that acknowledge people's right to live the way they want, which now these days I think is more like, how do we get rid of the policies that prevent your right to live the way that you want? And another way to look at it is that, roughly speaking, everyone's familiar with Democrats and Republicans and right and left. And let's just think through something called economic rights and social rights, kind of like, what can I do with my money and what can I do with my body? And theoretically, the left liberals say you can do whatever you want with your body, make your choices that way, but we're going to tell you what to do with your money. And then the right conservatives might be the opposite, like your money's yours, but whatever choice you make with your body better fit these kind of traditional norms about, drug war, no gay marriage, signing up for the draft, back in the day, things like that. Yep. So one way to look at it is just, how do you feel about what you think the government's role is in your pocketbook and in your bedroom? It's a way to look at it. So there's actually, you can go online, the world's smallest political quiz, and you can find this chart. Everyone thinks it's a left-right thing. It's left-right, but there's two different parts of the system, the economics and the social rights. So really it's more of a two-dimensional type of situation. So I'd encourage everyone, if they're just trying to figure out how they might fall or where they see others are looking out there, just go to world's smallest political quiz and figure out where you go kind of left or right on the social spectrum or on the economic spectrum of things.
So let me ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Jeremy. What is the role of the state?
Yeah, great. The role of government is to do only the things that only the government can do. And so my thoughts are the courts, the police, and the military, because if we're in a society where we're not supposed to lie, we're not supposed to cheat, we're not supposed to steal, there's got to be some arbiter of what that means. And that's where the government comes in. That's where the courts come in. And then also too, I'm going to point out something about the Libertarian Party, which I think is great, is when you join the Libertarian Party, you need to sign a pledge saying, I certify that I oppose the initiation of force to achieve political or social goals. So if you are somebody that thinks this is the way the culture ought to be, the way the world ought to be, That's great. Go hand out some pamphlets, go put some money towards your nonprofits, but don't you dare get elected to government and use the power of government, the power of force to make it your way. And honestly, if you think of it, and I think most people can agree with this, the government is allowed to use force. Like if you lie or cheat or steal, they can use force to put you into jail. They can use force to take your money out of your bank account on there. And so that's where it comes in. Okay, in my mind, those are the three main examples: is the courts, the police, and military. That's the role of government.
And how about you, Steve? Would you differ at all from that in any way?
So I think that's a really nice summary, and Jeremy's position on sort of the role of the state, I think, is the absolute kind of classic sort of down the middle libertarian position. I think there's a whole set of interesting questions about whether government is the only thing that can do those things. And the more anarchist inclined libertarians have asked, or trying to ask those questions and see whether there aren't alternatives, alternative dispute mechanisms, alternative ways of enforcing, generating and enforcing the law that we might talk about. I'm not sure that the answers there are always persuasive, but it's a really interesting line of thought. And I think one of the key distinctions that those folks make is we have to have governance. We have to have rules. We have to have ways of enforcing those rules, right? Otherwise, we can't, know where the limits are between what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in the way that Jeremy talked about, right? Because my freedom, your freedom, what happens if they clash, right? How do we resolve those things? So we need rules, we need governance. The question is whether government, as we've traditionally understood it, is the only or best way to supply it. I think the other point I'd add to what Jeremy said is that if you have, libertarians tend to think if you have government doing things, you should try as much as possible for them to not be in a monopoly position. So there's things that perhaps the private sector can do or that civil society can do, just not enough of it maybe. And so government needs to supplement it to make sure there's enough of it. Okay, so supplement it, but don't necessarily mean that that's you're the only provider of that good. So I think that's a couple thoughts. One other thing I'd add, in addition to the political quiz, world's smallest political quiz, another place folks might want to go, Cato Institute has a site called libertarianism.org. I frequently write there, and there's some other good folks writing there. But on that site, there's a sort of introductory essay called something like "What is Libertarianism?" or "What is a Libertarian?" I think that piece is the single best piece I've ever read about, sort of, this is my libertarianism. This is what it means to me, and this is how I would express it. There's no way I could have done any better than what Grant Babcock did in that piece. So that's if you're interested, I think that's a really good piece to read as well. And I'm thinking about one last thing. I think Jeremy's point about the things that government can do as a monopoly that citizens can't do themselves, like force people to do things. I think that's at the heart of why libertarians have been for a long time concerned about police overreach and criminal justice reform, because the cops can do stuff that if we did it, we'd be in jail, right? And you can even recognize that police are in a unique position. But when you kneel on someone's neck for 9 minutes, right? If I did that, I'm out of here, right? And it seems to me that sort of finding ways, given that the state has a police force, finding ways to limit what they can do and hold them responsible when they overstep those boundaries should be a core libertarian concern, and has been among some libertarians for a long time. And my view is glad to see everyone else is catching up with us. Same thing as same-sex marriage, because we were in favor of that long time. Everyone else had to catch up to us.
Yeah. So I just got back from a vacation, and I flew on an airplane, and I had confidence that airplane had gone through some type of certification, that the pilots had some type of training. And so I don't have to worry about that. Now, what would a libertarian say about that? Because that is, to some extent, is a state role, is a government role, a certifying body to certify that this plane isn't going to just drop out of the sky. So how would a libertarian view that kind of role for government, as an example?
So it's interesting that you use the word certification. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Do you have an alarm clock, like a clock radio at home, or a toaster
on my phone?
Toaster oven?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
when you turn that thing on, what assurance do you have that it's not going to blow up, right? Or that's not going to light on fire? The assurance you have is actually a certification, not from the government, but from Underwriters Laboratory. Look in the back, look underneath it. I have a friend who used to do this lecture in class, and he'd bite into the electrical cord of his overhead projector or something, right? It's all certified by UL. UL is a private organization, it's been around for decades, and the manufacturers bring their products to UL for UL to certify it. The manufacturers have a reason to want to say to consumers, this won't blow up when you turn it on, right? And so they're more than willing to do that. And we see this role for certification in lots of other places, right? Auto repair people get certified by their governing body. Scuba divers have this governing body. All this kind of stuff. There's all of this governance, right? That does this, and through market mechanisms. So you know, when we talk about things like airplanes, right? More complicated. And we can point to these examples where, you know, the 737 MAX went through that government process, yet problems, right? So I think that there, you know, for libertarians, the question is how, sort of to follow on Jeremy's point, was how many of those things could be done through alternatives to government, and will they be done better? Because one of the things that happens when government does it is that various interests want to play that to their own advantage. So you can bet, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure that the rules on airline safety and airplane safety probably have built into them some features that favor the large corporate airlines over smaller places, because I'm guessing that the large corporate airlines were involved in the writing of the regulations, right, that produce them. So when the state does that, we often get these, what we call rent seeking, this sort of the desire on the part of private actors to have the regulations tweaked in ways that benefit them. So that's a cost we have to recognize, right? That's, you know, maybe doesn't settle it definitively, but certainly there's advantages to certification through the private sector that it has advantages that over government regulation. And we certainly see that at the smaller scale, where like occupational licensure laws that the state imposes raise costs, lower quality, harm the poor, and often folks of color as well. So, you know, if those are things we care about, there are private sector alternatives, and we need to look at them and make it easier for them to operate.
Yeah, I'm a certified financial planner,
right.
And
yes,
the certification I went through is hundreds of times harder than the licensure I went through to sell stocks and bonds through the government. And just even right now, there's kind of a debate amongst certified financial planners. Should we get lobby for and get licensed by the government? Yeah. And in a way, it's somewhat self-serving. Like if there's less people that can call themselves a financial advisor, more people will go directly to me. So that's adding on that government licensure. I wouldn't mind it. It would work better for me.
I predict your fees will go up, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a great example. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about.
Now, would it be fair to say that we're really talking about degrees and we're talking about pendulum swings here? Because it seems like, you know, we've got this, you know, main two-party political system. You know, for one or two terms, we've got a Democrat president, and then people don't like that, and then it swings to the total opposite end, and we've got a Republican president, and then it swings back and forth and back and forth. So it's almost as if we're oscillating between these two extremes. And even with libertarianism, is it fair to say that within the libertarian view that there's even degrees? You've got the anarcho-capitalist wing, and then you've got probably more moderate libertarians who say, yeah, there's probably some role for government in here. Are we thinking degrees here?
Yeah, I think so, right? And I think it's important to understand sort of historically for a second, right? Sort of modern libertarianism grew out of the broad liberal movement that started, you know, 400 years ago, and more precisely, sort of what we can call the classical liberalism of the 19th and early 20th century. And so, you know, at one end of that kind of spectrum, you have people say like F.A. Hayek, who we would call a classical liberal, who thought the state should have more responsibilities than I certainly think the average libertarian would today. But nonetheless, right, well, I think you categorize them broadly as a libertarian. And then the other end, you have the anarcho-capitalist types who see zero role for government. I do think, you know, that so can we all get along, right? Can we all exist within that tent? I think we can. I think as long as we recognize that on the margin, everyone wants to go toward the same place, right? We all want to be freer in all of these kinds of ways. You know, when critics of libertarianism say to me, kind of, you know, the old, what about the roads, right? Who's going to take care of the roads? My response now is I say to them, oh, we're agreed on everything else, right? So you're just worried about the roads. I don't care what happens to the roads. If we're agreed on everything else, we're 98% of the way. Right,
I'll give you the roads.
Right. So you know, I can live with government roads if you're going to give me everything else.
Right.
So I
and airplanes.
Right. That's what I didn't want to play that card with your airplane example, but it's the same. It's exactly the same thing, right? So yeah, I think that's there is all of that going on, and I think it's one interesting story about Hayek, though, that I have to tell is in his old age, in his 80s, maybe 70s, 80s, he was with a bunch of young libertarian, you know, Austrian economists. Many of them anarchistically inclined, many of them names you might know now, but they were young at the time this conversation happened, and they were all trying to kind of persuade him, right? Sort of, you know, like you should take this seriously and all that. And finally, he kind of waved his hand and he said, "Look," he says, "I'm an old man, right? I grew up in a whole different tradition." He said, "I can't. I see how this is interesting. I said, but I can't." He said, "But if I were a young person today, right, this would be really, really attractive and sort of, you know, fascinating." So there's that, because I think, right, all the libertarians of all stripes, right, generally agree that the size and scope of government needs to be smaller, that when people are left to their own devices under a consistent, clear framework of rules, they will produce good outcomes and lead to peace, prosperity, and progress. And these questions of just how much state that requires or doesn't require, I think, should be more interesting intellectual questions than they should be reasons that divide libertarians. There's enough work to be done on the things all libertarians agree on to not be bonking each other over the head over the small things that we don't agree on. I mean, I think, at least in terms of what the size and scope of the state, there's some other, I think, interesting controversies in the Libertarian Party right now where drawing some lines might be important, but over the core idea, right, the sort of anarchist versus minimal state folks versus classical liberals, everyone should be able to get along in the LP.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it too, if you don't mind, Steve.
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so part of being on the Libertarian National Committee, we did a study trying to just figure out how do people believe anyways in America. And Steve Sandusky, your question was, you know, it swings wildly from left to right, Democrat to Republican. And I just think it doesn't swing wildly at all. It's just, my wife hates politics and we're in a political area. And so everyone's asking like conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. So she's like, what is this? What does it even mean? And my definition was Democrats, Republicans, or conservatives and liberals, they're just trying to take over the government to tell you to live the way that they want to live. And yet a libertarian doesn't mind taking over the government to tell you, do what you want. We're going to stop telling you what to do on there. So that the study we did, of course, is about 15 years ago. I got a feeling it's pretty similar now, is that there's roughly 20% of libertarians, 20% of the electorate were libertarians, 25%, we call them counter-libertarians. They felt strongly like the government should be telling you what to do, whichever way they thought it should go. And then everyone else was down the middle. And what Steve, you were saying is that there might be degrees of libertarianism. Part of our study, we found there's not so much degrees of libertarianism. It's just that there's a bunch of issue voters that maybe collect together in the Libertarian Party mindset. And back then, and I've got a feeling it might be somewhat similar right now, but back then, the most libertarian issues, if you asked Americans and classified, okay, if you are feeling this way, then it's maybe more the libertarian issue. And if you're feeling a different way, it's not the libertarian issue. But gay marriage, war in Iraq back then, and your ability to own guns, you know, self-right to own guns. Find me one person, especially back in George Bush 2006, that said yes to gay marriage. Let's get out of Iraq. Oh, and by the way, let's let everyone you know, have their Second Amendment right. It's not that there's here's what libertarians believe. It's just a lot of people are libertarian-ish on a lot of different issues. And that's one thing that I found, at least within libertarian circles is, hey, leave the philosophy to the outside of the electorate. If there's a top 10 issues, find the ones we can all agree on, work on those ones. In fact, find the ones that America agrees on and go work on those first, and then go on for there.
That's great. Yep.
Yeah, and we could definitely talk a lot more about politics here, but I think about Republicans. So prior to 2016, I think there was an idea of what it meant to be a, quote, Republican. And then during the Trump years, it seemed like what a, quote, traditional Republican became something very different. And so whether it's issues that changed, I mean, like traditional Republicans used to be against tariffs. Well, then Trump gets in and all of a sudden tariffs are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And a lot of the Republicans went along with that. So what they used to disagree on, now it's like, oh yeah, that's a great tool that we can use. So again, this isn't designed to, really dig that much into that, but
it's team sports, right? Whatever, it doesn't matter who's on my team or what, whether my football team switches from a running team to a passing team, they're my team. So I'm going to stick with my team. That's
right.
It's
so a lot of tribal stuff and, a lot of other reasons, power issues and so on and so forth that are kind of outside of the scope of where we want to go here. But
and one other quick thing I'll add, which is I think that this sort of oscillation between Democrats and Republicans is a sign that neither one of them can handle the beast they've created in the size of the modern American state. And so they're always screwing up some number of things, no matter how good their intentions are. And so the voters, it's the marginal voters who go the other way because they screwed up this, and they go the other way because they screwed up that, right? But the fact that they keep screwing up is I think, if I were, thinking libertarian politics strategy, would be that's where I drill in and say, look, you keep getting mad because people keep screwing up. Maybe it's not the coach, maybe it's the team. Maybe it's what you're asking government to do that's the problem, and that no one can do that. And so maybe you need to put people in power who recognize that and who can scale it back. That's another kind of message.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's, I think what you're saying is it's the structure of how we operate in government that's the problem. It's not necessarily the people that are populating it. It's the system within they operate.
Yep.
So, okay. So I do want to talk about Bitcoin here.
Yeah.
And so Bitcoin really kind of rose up through the Austrian, people that really had the Austrian view. A lot of gold bugs really got into Bitcoin early. Libertarians certainly, not all, but many of them really grabbed onto. Yeah. Well, maybe not today.
No, but I had opportunities to buy like in the first couple of years. And
yeah. So let me start with you. Yeah. So let me start with you, Steve. How do you think about Bitcoin? And it came out essentially in January of 2009, right at the depths of the Great Recession. And does it solve a problem that we have from either an Austrian view or a libertarian view? Does Bitcoin solve a problem?
I don't think it solves a problem. What it does is it offers an alternative to the standard money and banking system for a limited number of people who are doing a limited number of things. So that's why I'm hesitant to call it a money, or at least it's not a good money. It's not a currency. It's a digital asset that can be used as a medium of exchange and is used best in those in situations where you want pseudonymity or anonymity, right? Where you want privacy and over great distances, because of course it's digital. There's no, a lot of things we can do digitally now too, but it offers many of the benefits of cash because it's anonymous, pseudonymous, but it can travel over distances. So it has real value in that sense at doing money-like things. And I think one of the great strategies libertarians need to engage in and support is building alternative institutions to the state and to the things that the state tries to protect. So think of Uber here, right? And Lyft, which are alternatives to monopoly regulated taxi systems, right? Build an alternative, work around it. You don't have to pass a law to get rid of the monopoly, find a better way to do it, right? And so I think Bitcoin in that way is a good thing too. Is Bitcoin going to, replace the dollar? Is it going to be money in that sense? I don't think so. As we said, we're talking about it on a day when the biggest piece of evidence against its use as a money is happening, which is its fluctuations in value, right? You can't have a money that drops, at last I saw, 30% today, right, or 24 hours, right? That's just not going to work as a money. You need to have that relative stability in its value to work as a money. It won't do that. And as I understand it, I don't, I'm not a Bitcoin user, but as I understand it, when you use it for retail transactions or other similar sorts of things, there's a significant time delay between payment and verifying payment that I think is not going to work really well at the retail level. And then there's questions about things like, if I were buying clothing with Bitcoin, how do I get a refund if it doesn't fit? Right? I mean, there's sort of these practical questions, and maybe some of those can be solved. But I think until you can convince me that the value will stay much more stable, and that it can be used instantly and routinely, right? I mean, money is a generally accepted medium of exchange. The fact that you have to go into a store and ask, do you take Bitcoin, or look for a sign that says, do you take Bitcoin, I think is an indicator that it hasn't reached full-bodied moneyness yet. And you can see why, for all of these reasons, right, it would be attractive to Austrians, to gold bugs, to libertarians, right? It does provide this alternative. It does provide a privately produced, though not spontaneously emergent, I would note, right, designed by someone like Esperanto or Klingon in the world of languages. And so it's fascinating and it's interesting, and I think for some people in some markets it will continue to be a popular medium of exchange, but I don't see it becoming the thing that its most ardent partisans think, like the promise it will be. Not now, and not unless there's some significant changes there.
So some people talk about this idea of a Bitcoin standard. You may have heard of Saifedean Ammous, who wrote a popular book about that. And some people would say, well, maybe Bitcoin should be the central bank reserve instead of the US dollar. And that would cause the government can't spend more than they've got reserves in Bitcoin, for example. It's kind of the hard money digital gold idea. Is that even practical?
Not with these fluctuations in value, right? I mean, one of the things about gold and silver that made them serve so well as monies was that they were reliable stores of value, right? And until Bitcoin's price fluctuation settled down, it's really, really hard to have a money that's also an investment vehicle where people are either holding on for dear life or trying to make money off the short-term fluctuations. That's that's not going to work either as a hand-to-hand, a medium of exchange, or as a reserve currency. It's just not. Yeah. And I think some of the Bitcoin folks will say, well, give it time, it'll settle down. Okay, maybe, and then we'll have this conversation again. But for now, no.
Well, look at gold though, and maybe I may know how you're going to respond to this, but I remember back in the early 1970s, gold was pegged at $35 an ounce. And then when they severed that final link in the early 70s, within 8-9 years, it was briefly $800 an ounce. And then, of course, it fell way back down.
Yeah. So two things. I think three things. One, that was pegged, right? So that wasn't a market price at all for gold. And so when you take off the peg, the market price comes in, and everybody knew that was going to happen. So it's about expectations, right? It's also the case, and I think the Bitcoiners will nod when I say this, that part of what caused gold to shoot up was, in fact, that we were having inflation and gold was perceived as a hedge, right? And so everyone, the inverse relationship there. And I think there's Bitcoiners who see it that way now too. And certainly the rise in the last year before today might be seen as a lot of inflation hedging, but okay, which is fine. But now you're treating it, how much fluctuation are we talking about? That rise in gold's price was slow and steady. It wasn't 30% per day or something like that. And it doesn't have to be stable. It just needs to be reasonably stable and predictable. And I don't think Bitcoin's there yet. Maybe it will be. And if it is, then this is a different conversation, but I don't think it's there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned this word spontaneous order, and I know that's a term that is in the vernacular of the Austrian school, and I think you said that Bitcoin does not really fit that, because we have Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that person is or whoever they are, you know, they're still anonymous or pseudonymous at this point. So we don't know who they are, whether they're even still alive. But you would suggest that Bitcoin does not fall under the category of spontaneous order. And if you could just describe what spontaneous order means.
What we mean by spontaneous order or emergent order or unintended order, the short definition is products of human action, but not human design. The absolute classic example, of course, is the evolution of money, right? Which is nobody invented money. There was no, as I tell my classes, there's no Sir John money in 1714, right? That money emerged out of people engaging in barter and then realizing some good. That barter was challenging. It was costly to find trading partners. And so if you had a good that other people wanted more than the thing you started with, if you got that good and then traded that for the ultimate thing you wanted, that was better. People experimented with different mediums of exchange, and then network effects, right, which is a big part of the Bitcoin literature, are such that if it's the thing that lots of people like, it's going to be better. And then the more you use it, the better it becomes, and so on. It's not good having a fax machine if you're the only one with a fax machine, right? So after a while, right, this process narrowed down to one or maybe two goods that served as money. So money emerged in this way from human action, from human choices, but no one designed it, no one planned it that way. And there's all kinds of examples: the evolution of the common law, the way markets work, the evolution of human morality, all of these things. My other one I use is if you're a place where there's a lot of snow and get a big snow and a big open place, and you'll see the paths get worn through the snow, okay, or hiking trails, for example. No one put a sign out telling you to walk here, but these sort of reasonably rational patterns of trails emerge. So all those are spontaneous orders. And the argument is that the things that emerge spontaneously this way are better because they've come from people's actual use and people's actual needs. Bitcoin came from the top down, but which is okay. I mean, I think, but for the same, the things that prevent it from being a very good money, right, which are the sort of costs of using it, which are costs that technologically savvy people in particular markets where being able to be anonymous or pseudonymous was particularly important, were willing to pay those costs, right, to have this thing. But for most of us, no, we wouldn't be. And so it didn't, right, in the ways that these other monies, gold or silver, emerged, this couldn't and didn't. And I do think it's part of the story about why it's not really a money or a good money today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people today
quick thing. It also means that it's not connected to anything real ultimately, right? And the Bitcoiners, in many cases, say that's a good thing. But even the fiat dollar, right, we can trace the link back to gold, 71 for starters, but farther than that too, right? And so we know, how did that money get its value? Why does it have value? They're just pieces of paper with ink on it, right? Why does it have value? Well, because we have this historical process. And I think that's also related to the stability and instability question as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think the Austrians talk about this idea of subjective value. And so, what is Bitcoin worth? It's kind of what you're throwing out here. Well, it's worth what people are willing to pay for.
That's right.
It's a subjective idea.
That's right. And remember, part of its value as money is your perception of how many other people will accept it if you try to spend it. And the answer to that still is not that many, right? Even though they can say, well, there's 100 millions of users, 7-8 billion people on the planet, right? Even if you say there's just 4 billion who are, in advanced market economies or whatever, that's a pretty small group. It's like this classic story of cigarettes and prisoners of war camp, right? They served as money. They were commonly accepted medium of exchange in the camp, right? But if you tried to spend cigarettes at the city, you weren't going to necessarily be able to do that. And I think that's kind of where Bitcoin is within the digital communities, right? And some, buy your Tesla with it or whatever, right? And some other places you can spend it, but it's still a very limited, just not geographical, right? It's technological and transaction cost.
Yeah, and I think Bitcoin kind of fought that war a few years ago when they had the split between should Bitcoin be the kind of thing that I use to buy my Starbucks, or should it be more of a store of value? And so we had that big internal civil war, and clearly the Bitcoin as a store of value, the digital gold idea, that's the one that definitely won out. And I think that's definitely the narrative at the moment.
Yeah, and it's not a very good one. I mean, it's not a very good store of value as we're seeing today.
All right. Well, I know we got to wrap up here, so I want to give each of you a last word here. So, Jeremy, let me toss it over to you first. Any final comment that you have here?
Yeah, I'd just like to answer, I think, my take on the question you had earlier of why are libertarians drawn to cryptocurrency? Interesting enough, I've somewhat was drawn to it, alternative currencies. I bought gold when I was 20. I bought the American Liberty dollar when I was 21, an alternative currency. I was telling you earlier, Steve, that I sold it to move out to Wisconsin and, eventually marry my wife and have a business. So I think it was probably a good investment overall. And I remember hearing about Bitcoin back in the day, and I thought $100 is way overpriced. So I love that Steve's calling it a digital asset, because I saw it and said that's too much of a cost to buy Bitcoin back then. And apparently I was wrong on that. But
many of us were.
Yeah. But the reason why libertarians are drawn to cryptocurrency, just think through of if someone believes the government should not be telling them what to do or telling others what to do, and the government controlled bank is controlling the economy and the means of exchange with the money, then there's just going to be this natural attraction to non-government controlled currencies. There's just a natural attraction there. And I think I finally got it. It took me, 12 years, 10 years to get why Bitcoin perhaps is a good investment, is why there's a value there. I was watching The Sound of Music over Christmas, with the family, and the Von Trapps all of a sudden have to pack up and leave to go to the US, leave their house, leave their business, leave their money behind. And I thought, if only they had Bitcoin, completely outside of the, Nazi government control. If only they had Bitcoin, then, they might've had a better go of it to start out when they left that bad regime, bad government. Having alternatives to government control currency would have been a big help to them.
Yep. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. And Steve, any final comment from you?
I think, one question we didn't talk about that I'll just sort of bring up at the end. I think it's really important to distinguish Austrian economics from libertarianism. We've kind of wandered, back and forth between those two. And there's a lot of libertarians who would never, even professional economists who are libertarians, who would not consider themselves Austrian economists. There are Austrian economists who don't like calling themselves libertarians. And I think it's important to remember that Austrian economics is a body of social science. It's a set of theories and results and so on. And it's an analytical framework we use to try to understand the world. And I think it requires additional outside assumptions to sort of translate into libertarianism. And I think the sort of major figures in Austrian economics were conscious about that, Mises and Hayek and others, that they weren't the same thing, and that Austrian economics could be done in a value-free kind of way, but libertarianism is a political philosophy. And so I think keeping that straight, and there's, folks today who refer to themselves as Austro-libertarians, and I really hate that because it conflates the two. I think I know what they're trying to say, but it really conflates the two in a problematic way. So I think Austrian economics as a body of knowledge and a way of thinking about the world is really important and valuable, and your viewers might want to investigate more. And just a little pitch, one place they can go is my Introduction to Austrian Economics volume. If you go to libertarianism.org and Cato Institute, you can find it and download it there for free. That's, I think, a pretty good place to start. But I think it's important to recognize that's a separate set of questions from the normative question of what's the best way to live together. And that's the kind of question that libertarianism tries to answer.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And Steve, so you mentioned the book, a recent book here that you wrote about Austrian economics. And so I've read that, which I think is an important book. I certainly encourage people to read that. And your website, if they want to learn more about you, what would be the best place to go?
I do have a website, www.sghorwitz.com. There's some stuff there. It's not as complete as I'd like it to be. That's been an ongoing neglected project, but that's a good place. As I said, I do write at libertarianism.org. You can find stuff there. If you go to Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, there's a lot of my old columns that are there. Also old stuff at Bleeding Heart Libertarians. The best way to keep up with what I'm doing is on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter, but on Facebook, you can either follow my personal page. I'm at the friend limit. You can follow my personal page, or you can I have a public page also, and a quick Facebook search. You'll know it's me. If you're watching this, you know what I look like. And there's no other Steve Horwitz economist. So feel free to follow me either of those places.
Sounds good. And Jeremy, the best way for folks to connect with you?
Yeah, I suppose you can check me out on LinkedIn. It's Jeremy Keil, Keil, when you look me up there too, or go to my website, KeilFP, KeilFP.com. I love talking about retirement planning, financial advisor marketing, and thank you, Steve, for reinvigorating my love of talking about politics as well.
Well, my pleasure.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you, and those of you watching or listening to this, you can get all the details, the show notes and links at stevesandusky.com. And I want to thank you, Jeremy. I want to thank you, Steve, for taking some time here today and really sharing your knowledge and wisdom on these important topics here today. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.